Hi, and welcome to The Pollsters. I'm Margie O'Mara, Democratic pollster with PSB Research.
And I'm Kristen Soltis Anderson, Republican pollster with Echelon Insights.
And each week we bring you the polls driving the news in politics, tech, and pop culture. Well, we're so excited to have not only on remote, we have in the studio here, we have Geoff Garin from Garin Hart Yang, a Democratic pollster. He's been around for a long time, since I've been in the business. In fact,
before Margie's been born.
I don't know if it's been quite that long, because that is kind of a long time now. But in fact, when I very first started my business, you sent me this incredibly nice note. I don't know if you remember. You sent me a very nice email. And I always remember that. So when you said, if you ever want to come over here, just let me know. And that was always like in the back, like when I had like a bad day, I was like, well, I guess I could always go work for Geoff Garin. Like I thought maybe you had long forgotten that note, that know, but that was a good
Always admired your work.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very sweet of you to say. And I'm so glad you could come by. You actually come in the studio, and Kristen is in Cleveland, so everything is noisy and crazy, as I'm sure everybody can imagine. So she sends her regrets. She could not make it at this time, but
she's a favorite of mine.
Yes, so everybody's a fan of everybody else's. So we wanted to talk a little bit, one, about what everyone seems to be talking about this week is what's going on in the Republican convention. How does it strike us as Democrats watching it? And also, what does it make us think about polling headed into November, testing, what's going on in the conventions? And Geoff is a great person to talk about this, as he does work for Priorities PAC. So why don't you tell us first a little bit about Priorities USA, what that is, and then we can talk about the craziness on the convention floor.
Well, Priorities USA first came together for the 2012 election on behalf of President Obama, and it was a new thing on our side of the aisle in those days, and we did very effective work. We were kind of a leaner band then, but we I think created some advertising that was the most memorable from the 2012 cycle. And we've come back together for 2015, 2016. We started working more than a year ago getting ready for this election, and Priorities USA has now become a much bigger operation, I think, with much greater bandwidth. It's being led by Guy Cecil, who was the executive director of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee. He and I worked together on Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign. And we're doing, we're primarily...
And Ann Caprera, who's a political director, who's one of the funniest people on Facebook, period, of all of Facebook, I think.
I love Ann. And she, day to day, she's really kind of steering the ship and keeping everybody in line in the way that only Ann can do. But we're primarily an advertising organization, but we've expanded and doing, I think, leading edge work in digital advertising. I think there was a note the other day that some of the two of the most effective digital ads on our side were things produced internally at Priorities USA. Tara McGowan leads that part of the operation. We're doing work that is focused not only on the broad electorate, but we have a project at Priorities USA on Latino voters, on African American voters, and we're doing work with Emily's List on millennial women. So that it's become a much more expansive operation. It's super disciplined. We're very conscious of making the best use of every penny, and we do the research along with Global Strategy Group, Jeff Pollack and Nick Gurovich. It's a real team between the two of us. We did the polling together for Priorities in 2012, and we really operate as a single group, as if we were one firm for this purpose. And our approach to research is very, very similar. So it's super easy.
Well, that's good. I can feel that when you say, well, we've done this and we've done this. Doesn't sound like you have some of the, infighting or siloed things you hear sometimes about campaigns, or some of the, who's in charge worries that you see sometimes.
It's one of
what's
the nice
going on
things
the Republican
about
side.
working for a super PAC as opposed to the campaign itself, that it's a bigger operation than it used to be in 2012, but it's still a small group of people. We get along well. We all have one objective, which is to make sure Hillary Clinton gets elected president in November, and we are all pulling very much in the same direction.
So tell us a little bit about how you might test some of the ads or words, let's be more specific, that you've been using, that Priorities has been using in some of its ads. I mean, you've had Priorities did this great ad where it had, a lot of the ads have really focused on using Donald Trump's own words, specifically about women. There was ads with women wearing T-shirts with Trump's face on it. Am I describing it properly?
You are, yeah.
That was pretty powerful, and it certainly went viral. How, when you test that sort of thing, do you just play Trump's words and focus groups? Can you tell us a little bit about it? I mean, without going into
Well, it works. A lot of our ad testing is done online with online panels of voters in the states where we're going to do our advertising, and we try to make sure that we are measuring the impact of the advertising on the dimensions that really matter. People, is this something that you pay attention to? Is it believable? What's it make you think about Donald Trump? Ads, I think when you're measuring the impact of ads, it's not, it's not merely a mechanical, process, in that advertising is done in service of sort of a larger strategic objective, that the strategy comes first in terms of what is it you want to get people to think or understand about Donald Trump that they may not, or what are the things you want to reinforce, so that our advertising, and all good advertising, is purpose driven. And so it's not whether people like the ad or the ad is powerful, but does it also serve the larger strategic purpose? So we're very focused on that. And for these ads that use the Trump quotes, and a lot of our advertising does that, is that our partners at Global Strategy Group have done extensive testing of literally hundreds of clips of Donald Trump online to see what really cuts through to people, and what's
no shortage of material.
There is no shortage of material. That's actually quite interesting, because, as you know from your political life, what you normally do is you get these very big research books, and believe me, in Donald Trump's case, the research books are endless in terms of kind of his past lives and misdeeds in Trump's case. But here, the best material is stuff that has been created since Donald Trump has started to be a candidate. It's things he said that there is an upside for him, and his love of the media and his ability to dominate the media through tweets and through these kind of provocative interviews. But they also create a lot of source material that, as general election voters kind of look at what he said and think about what he said, that raises very deep doubts in people's minds whether this is the kind of person who they want to be president of the United States. So that whether it's quotes about women, or about his views on military affairs, or other groups other quotes that are kind of really give a sense of sort of being a bullying or divisive person. All have, kind of revealed themselves in the research to have a lot of power. But this testing that Geoff Pollock and Nick Gurovich at GSG has done, I think has been incredibly helpful and directive in all of that. We also, we show people things in in focus groups as well. And we've had one ad that I think is really a compelling and outstanding ad featuring about a little girl named Grace who was born with born with spina bifida. If people if they haven't seen it, you should find it on YouTube. It really is quite a very powerful ad, and it has Grace's parents speaking throughout the ad, reacting to something that Donald Trump did earlier in the campaign, where he made fun of a disabled reporter whose reporting Trump didn't like. It had to do with 9/11. And he, physically kind of imitated the guy's disability in a kind of grotesque way. I mean, in a mean and grotesque way. And we showed that clip to people in focus groups as a part of showing lots of other things about Donald Trump. But that one really broke through and stood out in a way that nothing else did, just, in some ways because of the meanness of it, but also because people know someone with a disability in their lives. And I was in Florida in one focus group, and there was a man there who was going to vote for Donald Trump. And he saw this clip and he said, "I'm the father of an autistic son, and I could never vote for Donald Trump, because of the, the callousness of mocking somebody with a disability.
Who is, defenseless, or at least is did not kind of ask to be part of this exchange. I mean, you could make a case, I suppose, if you were looking for a reason to side with Donald Trump, you could say, well, Rosie O'Donnell, Megyn Kelly, they, have entered the political arena in a way that makes this exchange fair game somehow. But I mean, I could disagree, but I could see how you could try to torture yourself to get there if you wanted to support Donald Trump. But that's not the case for this.
Very different here. But what that sentiment that father expressed in the focus group, and we had another dad in Philadelphia who said something very similar. That's essentially what that ad became, and it is a natural reaction to that. People, don't mind somebody who is tough as president, but their cruelty is not a quality that we look for in a president, and that's really what comes through in a very stark and disturbing way when people see that quote. Trump, of course, has said, "Oh, I didn't know the guy was disabled," which is a lie, and our ad has been
shocking.
Right,
Trump
right.
lie.
Our ad's been reviewed by ad watches, and they've been pretty clear that Trump's denial just doesn't bear any scrutiny at all.
So many cycles ago, I worked on a race. He was not my husband at the time, but is my husband now, where he did the ads. And we had a candidate we were running against, Don Sherwood in Pennsylvania. And Don Sherwood, it was an incredibly Republican district. It was 2006, super, super Republican. He had this story where he had allegedly tried to strangle his mistress, and she ran into the bathroom. She locked the door. She turned the shower on so he couldn't hear her while she called 911. And that's pretty incendiary, but people, by the time it got kind of filtered and people heard about it, they're like, oh, well, he cheated on his wife. I don't know if that's really a problem. We had to really tell the story in a way that it was clear this was not sort of a run-of-the-mill, congressman dalliance in Washington. This is actually really quite serious, and give permission for folks who may, just like these folks are talking about in their focus group, give permission for folks to say, you know what, I voted for him. But I'm not going to now. And
that's not the guy
I meant to vote for. And how can I tell my daughter that I voted for someone who did this? And so we had this, very similar. We had, real people who lived in a district show pictures of their family, say, I can't tell my daughter that I voted for him, and test it in ads. And people do not find it a negative. That kind of ad, even it may be contrastive, does not read as negative if you have actual people as opposed to actors, for example. That's, I think, the difference between, to go back to your earlier point, between having, a political ad firm versus, a more Madison Avenue commercial ad firm that maybe doesn't have that kind of ear for what voters are looking for.
Well, and this is a very important part of how we think about advertising and testing advertising today, because people don't just sort of, people are busy in their lives. They're in a presidential election, particularly, or in a highly competitive Senate race. They're just bombarded with stuff, and things go in one ear and out the other. They tend to be skeptical about advertising in general, and that skepticism has been measurably increased over time. And so it's very important for ads to, what we're looking for is ads that have, that people can connect with personally, that have that have a stickiness to them, that really stand out. A lot of negative advertising now is really kind of, a lot of print on the screen and an announcer essentially screaming at people. And, not surprisingly, people don't like to be screamed at from their TV all of the time.
And the production values are usually not as high as a more traditional commercial ad.
Right. And, in most of our ads, or many of our ads, we have either Trump talking or kind of a person talking, and true in other races that we do as well, rather than just having this sort of disembodied narrator. And, we did Priorities USA did the Grace ad that I've been talking about is a 60-second ad. And it takes sort of courage from a guy Cecil to sort of spend the money to run a 60-second ad. It costs twice as much money as running a 30-second ad. And in the 2012 campaign, we had where we did almost all of our advertising was about Mitt Romney's work at Bain Capital and the effect it had on people's lives. We did an ad that was really quite powerful, and about a guy who was asked to build a stage at his company, and it turns out the purpose of the stage was somebody from Bain getting up there to tell people that they're all being fired.
I was building my coffin, right? Wasn't that the line?
Right, and that's the guy, what he said. I said, I when I built that stage, I felt like I was building my coffin. And a very powerful line. So we went to Columbus in early October, and this ad had not run since August. And in the focus groups, I asked people, what do they remember seeing what commercials do they remember seeing in the campaign? And Ohio was sort of ground zero for advertising. So they'd, been besieged with stuff and believed that there was a Senate race going on.
I don't even know how people want to turn on the television when they live in a battleground state like that.
People not only remembered this ad, the 60-second ad that we had run 6 weeks earlier, but they recited the closing line. And it really meant a lot to them. They really the story to them was revelatory, and about Mitt Romney's heart and soul, and really because largely because of that research, that's how we ended the campaign in Ohio and in other states as well. And Ohio was one of the places where President Obama did a little bit better with blue collar women, and I think that helped. Help his margin there, and that ad turned out to be, I think, was central to kind of really connecting with blue collar women about the difference between Mitt Romney and President Obama.
So John Sides from Washington Post Monkey Cage wrote something, I don't know, a couple months ago, because there's this there's a narrative, I should say, in Washington that I've heard Republicans say too, that priorities defined Mitt Romney early through ads like the ones you're talking about, and then he had this ingrained image that you could not turn around, that by the time 47% comes around and all the rest of it was too late. The campaign was already lost. And the same thing's probably going to happen now because Trump hasn't been running any television advertising whatsoever, and priorities and other folks are doing stuff. But John Sides said, well, actually, that's not true because Romney was already vulnerable on these traits. It just kind of hardened what was already happening. It didn't sort of create a new Mitt Romney where none existed. It just firmed up the image that was already kind of there. I mean, what do you think? What's your take?
Well, that on these attributes that we were trying to deepen in terms of how people thought of Mitt Romney, that he looks, that he cares mainly about the wealthy and not the middle class, that there was measurable growth in those attributes as we were running our advertising in the places that we ran our advertising. So I think we ran them on this topic because people were primed for it. But that is a conclusion about Mitt Romney that we were hoping to be able to seal in people's minds. The mystifying thing, I mean, I think the real question, I don't have very much question in my mind about the impactfulness of the ad. I do have a lot of questions about why the Romney campaign or other Republican super PACs didn't try to do anything to
stop it.
Or to give people a different impression of Mitt Romney.
Right.
And I talked to a fellow from Crossroads after the election, Karl Rove's super PAC, and said, "Why didn't you?" And he said, "Well, we just didn't feel like our job was to do anything positive for Romney. That's not what super PACs do." But that was a moment when Romney,
that's a real pass the buck kind of answer.
Right.
Like, I mean,
and there's obviously no law that super PACs can't do.
Right. It's just for folks who are listening. It's just common practice because the theory goes that the candidate is best suited to talk about themselves in a positive way, and they may get some pushback if they go negative themselves. And so the super PAC then traditionally for the past couple cycles carries the negative and leaves the, which they can do because there's no voice of the super PAC. It's just this sort of.
Right. But there are counterexamples that are compelling there was an independent expenditure on behalf of President Bush in 2004. I think Larry McCarthy made the advertisement. And it was a father telling a very compelling story about his daughter and the way President Bush had stepped in and helped to kind of in a very personal way. And that also had a measurable impact in Ohio. So that was an instance of a independent expenditure telling a positive story. I think usually the case is that because we are independent, that we can't coordinate with the campaign, we obviously can't go interview the candidate.
Right, that's it.
And so that there's that kind of limitation.
And you're limited by the footage and all that kind of stuff.
But you can certainly interview people who have interacted with the candidate.
Right.
So you have kind of lots of options here.
Right. And for folks who remember when Mitch McConnell had all these videos on his website that launched a variety of Daily Show jokes. That was footage he was putting out in the world so a super PAC could help him. That was just like footage of him smiling at his desk or whatever it was.
The best example of that was Ted Cruz, whose B-roll was on of him, these super uncomfortable scenes with him and his family, and I think Trevor Noah had people make their own Ted Cruz ads off of that. It was quite hysterical. Yeah,
you get almost more traction from the spoof ads than from the ads made with the footage. But anyway, so that's the sort of digression of why that's the case. But I mean, I guess, with Mitt Romney, but you're right. I mean, it seemed like why not make him a little bit more positive? I mean, he was clearly capable of doing it. I mean, the folks who spoke on his behalf at the convention were able to really tell some nice stories about Mitt Romney. The documentary, which everyone said, oh, if we had seen this Mitt Romney, I don't think we've had a different result. But at least you saw Mitt Romney, be nice to his family, which I never doubted. He was nice as a dad or grandparent. It was just, did you agree with his policies? But still, it did give a little bit more to make him look less wooden. I think with Trump, I mean, I don't know if it's possible to have that kind of family endorsement. I mean, we've seen now some of his children and his wife speak, and I don't know if they've been able to really paint him in any kind of human light. I mean, what do you think? Would you test them as messengers? Would you ever want to see how they, if you were with the Trump campaign, would you test the Trump children or Melania as messengers? Or would you ever use them as examples of how, he's out of touch? I thought those family members seemed very much not relatable. It was hard for me to put aside my partisan hat watching
I think the
them.
one exception may be Ivanka.
Yeah. Tiffany was perfectly. I thought she seemed very nice. I just thought her stories, her anecdotes were not very humanizing. Like my dad called me when someone died. That
Right.
didn't mean to me. That was not.
And Donald Jr. gave a policy speech in some regards, as opposed to real. We didn't learn very much more about Donald Trump after as a result of Donald Jr.'s speech. But I do think that there are times when those speeches are helpful, and that there are things there that you want to repeat after the convention is over. I think I thought Ann Romney's speech in the 2012 convention was a good speech, but it was really about how Mitt Romney loves his family.
Right.
And Michelle Obama spoke at the 2012 convention, not the one that was cribbed by Melania the other night. But Michelle spoke, and her message was not just that President Obama loves his family, but also that he cares about your family.
Right.
And I think that really was the important part of the speech. And she told that in a very, I think, credible and compelling way. But what, she's a super admired figure in the country, and is one of the things that I always kind of, in our polling, I always think about, what are the kind of redeeming values that'll serve a politician well through thick and thin. Even in the worst of times for President Clinton, he always, people always thought, in his heart, he really cares about people like me.
Right.
And President Obama's family and his kind of his grounding as a kind of a family man really is a strength that it's one of the things where people are able to connect with him, even when you've got sort of pretty violent policy disagreements, and that kind of personal insight is very important in helping people who, may have other reasons to disagree with President Obama, kind of to find their way back to him. And of course, his approval ratings for all of this year have now kind of pretty consistently been more positive than negative.
Yeah.
And not having to do with his family, but having to do with, the sense that he looks good in comparison to what's going on in the rest of the political system.
Yeah, no, I mean, at some level, I feel like annoyed that we care about the candidates' families. I mean, at some level, it's like, well, why should it matter to me if some of the candidate gets along with their spouse? I mean, people have different kinds of marriages, and some of them don't go well. That doesn't really seem like it should have any bearing on anything else. And we judge, people are talking about the Trump family and the fact that Ivanka is poised, which she is, and she's lovely, and lots of people like hearing her speak. But does that really tell us anything we need to know about Trump's policy? I know that
people use. I think what is important in politics is that people be able to, see their story in the candidate's story.
Yeah.
And see their lives. One of my favorite political stories is from before even I was involved in politics, was when President Kennedy first ran for Congress in 1946. He went to visit Gold Star mothers, people who lost their children, their sons mainly in World War II. And the compelling line from that was, I think I know exactly how you feel. My mother is a Gold Star mother too. And for a politician to be able to say in a credible way, I think I know exactly how you feel, is magical and golden in politics.
Right.
And very few politicians have that skill, but it is very important to the voters in terms of how they think about their connection to somebody, whether they think somebody is really kind of sincere about the things that they say they want to do, or whether they'll be on whether the candidate will end up being on the side of the voters when push comes to shove in politics.
Yeah, I guess everybody just wants to be heard, whoever you are. Even Donald Trump, he just wants to be heard, right? We all just want to be heard. But so tell me, what's your take of where we go in our politics from here? I mean, it's really hitting. I mean, I've been doing this 20 years. You've been doing it for a little bit longer. I've never heard anybody say in a focus group like,
I'm in my 38th year at Heart Research.
Way to go. My God. Okay. So not as long as I've been alive, just for the record. But nobody says, way to go, Congress. You're doing a great job, right? I mean, I don't think that did anybody say that when you were in year 1 or 2 of Heart Research?
Well, I started a little bit after Watergate, but not long after Watergate.
Right. So not then either.
And by the end of the Carter administration, people were kind of feeling pretty unhappy with the world as well. I don't think that that's new, but I think we are, in a lot of ways, we are kind of in a crossroads in our politics. And at a crossroads as a country. And let me start with the crossroads as a country first, is that there's a lot of people who say, why wasn't there somebody who can bring the country together? I don't think it's going to be a politician who brings the country together. And I think, that'll happen as a result. But I think we're at a crossroads in the sense that we either embrace our diversity as a country, or that we try to kind of retreat to our corners. And there's no middle ground. That's really kind of what's being litigated in a way in this election. And my hope and expectation is that at the end of the day, that people will opt on the side of embracing our diversity. That's certainly true. I mean, that's a settled question with millennial voters, for example. Kristen knows much more about that than anybody else, but that it's part of who they are. But
right.
that view, I think, is spreading across generations increasingly. But also that people's cynicism and distrust about politicians and the political process is, this is not the only time it's ever happened in America. But we are at a moment where I think people are very much inclined to think that politicians are guilty until proven innocent. The burden of doubt is very much against people in politics. We're in an ironic situation, and we've done a lot of polling on this question for the Center for American Progress, where kind of on the one hand, people are skeptical about government, whether government can solve problems. But on the other hand, they actually want more government rather than less.
Right.
So when you talk about specific problems, they want government to be doing more, not less, to create jobs. They want government to be
more for me.
More.
They just want it to be doing less for somebody else.
Well, I'm not even sure that that's true, but part of the cynicism that we find in terms of people's attitudes about government is not that, necessarily that it's too big, and that it taxes too much. I mean, that part of the, traditional Republican critique, is, holds water with, some portion of the electorate, but what is far more deeply believed by Americans now about government is that it's working for somebody else.
Right.
I mean, that you're right, but not
somebody's getting a better deal.
Not necessarily that it's working for poor people. There's a little bit of that, but that it's essentially the critique that Bernie Sanders was making, or that Elizabeth Warren makes, but that also Donald Trump has made, and Ted Cruz occasionally during the Republican
Somebody's getting a better
process
deal.
is that
Yeah.
somebody's getting a better deal, and the more wealth and power and influence, the more government's going to work for you. And if you don't have that, if you're just an average American, it's not going to work for you at all. And people are very angry about that. And, the truth is that, if you're a politician today or if you're in government today, there's no middle ground here. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And we need more people who, if we're going to restore confidence in essentially the democratic proposition, we just need more political leaders to be part of the solution and convince people that they are. One of the things that I think was most disturbing in polling that I've seen is it's not just that people distrust politicians, but they also are starting to distrust each other.
Yes, that Gallup.
So that there's a polling question of do you trust voters to make wise choices?
Right, and that's going up. We've talked about that.
And there's been a sharp decline in the percentage of Americans who trust other Americans to make good political choices.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of at the heart of the democratic proposition, not the small d democratic proposition.
Right. And for a long, long time, people hated Congress but liked their member of Congress.
Yeah.
And now even that's not true anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
you guys do the NBC Wall Street Journal poll with Public Opinion Strategies,
Bill
Bill McInturf, Neil Newhouse, one of the partners we've had on the show before. But one of the questions that you guys ask on that poll is
if you get rid of them all.
Right. And isn't it like a
the
majority
reality
who
is
say,
that
yes,
at the
that we
House
get rid
level,
of
most people still get reelected.
Yeah.
True.
And they just like the idea of, well, they don't have the option to get rid of them all.
But, I think, it's interesting that in, the places where there's the greatest turnover is not kind of at the House level, but at the Senate level, where people don't know the candidates quite as well. And there's a lot more advertising in Senate campaigns. When I say don't know them personally as well. They're
not at the barbecue or local parade
and so there's been a lot of willingness to turnover. And the other thing that we're kind of just wrestling with that constantly in our political polling is are there really swing voters left in the electorate? Mm-hmm. I do think that there is a time, and this is sort of, I was thinking about this as I was watching kind of the nuttiness of the Republican convention over the past couple of nights, is that, I think there was a time where there really were kind of swing voters, people who considered both options, and either they didn't like either one, but they thought both of them were plausible options. And I think, more and more we have, the vast majority of Americans, if you push them hard enough, are either Democrats or Republicans. There are very few people left in the middle, which
most of them are not following very closely.
And so that, the Republican convention only makes sense. To me, it doesn't make any sense under any circumstances, but only makes sense if you think that kind of the only thing that matters to them is turning out the base,
right?
Energizing the base. And whether we're kind of in this situation now where, we've got these two camps in America, a Democratic camp and a Republican camp. And it is really, all politics is about anymore is rallying your camp as opposed to trying to win voters in the middle. I think, I think it is better for America in some ways if we, have a vibrant center. But I don't want to be Pollyannish about that. Is that, and I think that the changing demographics of the electorate also affects this. That there are, voters of color and young people who want to get their due in the political system, and I think that changes the political conversation quite a lot.
So here's here's the thing I kind of struggle with as I watch the Trump phenomenon, right? Which is at some levels really horrifying. I mean, it's not simply that we have policy disputes like you would have if you had Jeb Bush, who was no moderate. He was just moderate relative to the rest of the field, or Mitt Romney. But at least you felt like everyone was kind of vaguely speaking the same language. While what I see with Trump are two things. One is just, shining a light on, and now we're asking questions in public polling about things that were unthinkable to say in polite company about how people view Muslims or African Americans or Latinos in ways that are just really, I find so horrific. And then the numbers that you get are are surprising, and I don't get surprised very easily by poll results. And when you have Republicans who are on the sidelines, but still, kind of having tepid endorsements for Trump, or say, well, he's not my candidate, but, that's okay. I'm going to be with him. I feel like you have establishment and Republican voters who are complicit in saying, somebody who traffics in racist, sexist, hateful language, it is okay, is better than somebody who, and is also completely unqualified on top of that and incompetent, is somehow better than somebody with whom I have policy disagreements. And I just don't know how, I personally am going to get around that. When I want to be open-minded to Republican voters and Republican establishment, I want to have an open mind. And this is not just about people who feel the American dream is slipping away, which obviously lots of people feel, Democrats and Republicans. But there's so much that's focused on race and the worries about the other and just real bigotry. It's like hateful Twitter has become a political party. And I just don't know how we all kind of move beyond that. And even if Trump loses, he'll have been nearly tied in the polls for a long time, presumably before then.
Well, I think that's kind of the central question of this election. It's what's at the heart of the election. And I think in the in the Republican primary electorate, the audience for that kind of rhetoric is, substantial enough to comfortably nominate Donald Trump. I don't think it's where the center of gravity is in the national electorate, and we'll find out for sure. But I do think that that part of what if you look at the polling averages, there are a couple of polls where Trump's been higher than this, but if you look at the polling averages, Trump, even when Hillary goes down, Trump doesn't go up past the low 40s. I think he's got a little bit more upward potential, but not much, because I think that there is that most Americans do not really identify with the kind of hateful rhetoric of the Trump campaign. They certainly don't identify with somebody who is slow to or never does reject David Dukes and white nationalists when they support him.
The list is literally endless.
But we'll see where, I think this election is very much of a Rorschach test for the country in the way that presidential elections, I think, kind of uniquely can be. But we'll see a lot about where the center of gravity is. I think that, in some ways there are kind of two pieces to the Trump message. One is, that the elites have failed the country. And Donald Trump's not, in one of those guys, the political elites and the corporate elites and the kind of the international trade elites and all of those folks. And, I think there's an
argument there.
There's a there to that. And then the other part is now he's expressing kind of in the frame of law and order more and more. And Paul Manafort said that kind of, in a way that this is sort of deliberately and intentionally trying to imitate what President Nixon did in 1968. But the country is a very different country than it was in 1968. Not certainly in its experience of crime and lawlessness and disorder is different today than it was in 1968. Crime is actually at a relative low. In polling that if you ask people what are the most important issues facing the country, crime doesn't come up very high in the way that it would have been dominant in 1968 or in other
or even in the early mid 90s when
we had the crime bill that everybody is unhappy with now, but it was a product of a kind of a fearfulness that simply doesn't exist today in the country. And I think that the more Trump emphasizes that campaign, he will sort of undermine the anti-elite part of his message.
Yeah.
Because I think in some ways these are kind of warring messages with each other, or at least in terms of kind of the breadth of the audiences. And so, but I think. There are, as I said earlier, we're kind of at a fork in the road in terms of how we kind of deal with the diversity in our country. But this is a moment when, Americans really have to decide what kind of country we want to be. And it's, I am hopeful. I mean, I don't just work for Priorities USA. I'm an avid supporter of Hillary Clinton's, and I believe in Hillary Clinton. And I think I trust her to be able to put this question to the country in a compelling way.
So what do you make of the fact that her favorables are not really that different from Trump's, and her advantage over him is, single digits? It's consistent, but it's not. She's not dominating him when he is literally the worst candidate on the planet.
This goes to the kind of the political polarization I was talking about earlier. We have, roughly an even number of people who think of themselves as Democrats and Republicans, or certainly in the swing states and the likely voter electorate. And because of the people like Paul Ryan and others, rank and file Republican voters have been given a signal that they should rally around Donald Trump, and they've done that. And so, once he's passed that threshold, it's sort of baked into the cake that we're going to have a reasonably competitive election. And there are other things going on. I think it'd be kind of naive to ignore those. I mean, that in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that there's a question, I think, that kind of is a very well framed question about, do you want somebody who's going to bring about change, even if you don't know what that change is going to be,
I see.
versus somebody who's going to bring kind of more of a steady hand to things. And
it's like a line from Obama's White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Right.
Like when I said change, I should have been more specific.
Right. And so it was a great line. And by a 10-point margin, people say, I want the person who's going to bring change, even if I don't know what that change is going to be. And so, I think that's an important part of the backdrop of the race. And it's, hard to ignore that. I think the reality is that, Hillary Clinton has a pretty bold change agenda. But has not been, featured enough. And I think one of the challenge for her and for, is still, Donald Trump does soak up the oxygen, in terms of media coverage, even now. Reporters I do fault the media for this. Hillary Clinton gave 2 economic speeches 2 days in a row. The first one was attacking Trump, and the second one was laying out, I think, a pretty profound economic agenda. And the first one was, because it had these lines on Trump, was pretty well covered, and the policy one hardly very much at all. And but that's why
But that's not just the press's fault. I mean, that's what people want. People want, they don't want to hear about a policy speech.
I'm not actually sure that that's true. I that's not my experience. Certainly in kind of the research that we're doing with millennial voters, people want to know, what people want to know more than anything else? They clearly want to know who's going to make my life worse. But what they most want to know is who's going to help make my life better. That is the central question people would like the politicians to ask. Not even how they're going to make the country better, but how are you going to make my life better?
Right.
And they do, so that they do care about that. And, if you tell, Hillary's got, really, strong progressive ideas about changes in the healthcare system, taking on high prescription drug costs, or helping people afford their out-of-pocket costs through a series of tax deductions and credits. People find that compelling, but they don't. It's all new news to them. And so that's why the upcoming convention is so important. There are very few moments when candidates get to communicate with the country in an unfiltered way.
Right.
And so the convention will be one of those. And I'm kind of shocked the way the Republicans are using their unfiltered moment, which is to talk about Lucifer and either executing Hillary Clinton or sending her to jail.
It's unbelievable.
It is. I mean, the idea that they think that somehow putting this on TV is a good look for them is kind of
and Giuliani's like race speech. I mean, watching Giuliani, who has moments of brilliance or has had in his career, did not have one this week, even though he got the crowd all riled up. I mean, when he was like shouting, like basically the implication, like racial equality is here, just like close your eyes and imagine it, and then it's here. Basically, is how I took it. Like, if we just say it enough, then it'll be true. And a crowd that is completely homogenous, cheering and enthusiasm about it. I just found something so off-putting about it. I don't know how, do Republican establishment folks see that and say, okay, yeah, that turned out pretty well, or are they like, oh my God, what is happening? I don't know.
I mean, this is a kind of a substantial problem of arithmetic for the Republicans, because there are only so many white guys in the country, and
right.
It's really kind of non-college educated white guys. Their share of the electorate has declined radically since when President Clinton was first elected in 1992. I mean, really kind of, it's a much smaller piece of the pie.
Right. So even if you get 100% of them.
That would help you. That would be a good leg up. But, but Republicans do quite well with them. But Trump has really, made it likely that he'll get very few votes from voters of color, whether it's African American or Latino, even Asian. He kind of turned off college educated white women have become a pretty good Democratic constituency, especially at the postgraduate level. But, for suburban women and, they're deeply turned off by Trump's rhetoric and approach. Some college educated white men are as well, particularly in terms of some of his kind of crazy national security talk. It doesn't leave Trump that many places to go to kind of grow his support. And this whole convention has been about, I think if anything, making the limitations on who could be for Trump even greater. Trevor Noah on Tuesday night the Tuesday after the first Monday of the Republican convention had a terrific and I think kind of a super strong opening monologue about the first night of the Republican convention. And I highly recommend it to all of your listeners. And it sort of captures a lot of the nuttiness of that night.
Just like Chris Rock's tweet, like, oh, so far the convention's pretty good. When does George Zimmerman speak?
Right. No, exactly.
Which, I mean, is painful, obviously, but,
Well, I tweeted something the other night. There was you'll remember this in 2008, a woman at a McCain rally said to McCain, "I can't be for Obama. He's an Arab."
Right.
And McCain said, no, he's not. He's a good man. I have disagreements with him, but he's a good family man. And so, that's a kind of decent response to that.
Right.
Donald Trump would have made her a convention speaker. And,
right.
it is
campaign advisor.
It's pretty shocking. And the bar has been so lowered, in terms of what's acceptable. And, the only way the bar will get raised is if the voters kind of weigh in and say it is unacceptable. And I'm hoping that's what will happen in November.
So before we wrap up, what sort of advice would you give to young folks interested in becoming pollsters, getting involved in polling as an industry? People are always kind of wringing their hands about the future of polling. It's all, polling crises lurk around every corner. What advice would you give?
First, I'd say it's the greatest job in the world. As I said, I started in 1978, so a very, 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 very long time ago. And I still love coming to work every day. I learn something new every day.
Oh, that's great.
And the kinds of things that we get to think about and learn about are really varied. And I enjoy the people in the field and the clients I get to work with. So it's a great profession. And if you're thinking about it, if you're a young person and you're thinking about it, it's something you should really think hard about. And, in terms of, that as with lots of other fields, that the work we do is being married much more intensively with kind of analytics. So it's the film. In film, it would be post-production,
right?
So kind of the post-survey analytics is becoming more and more of important, in part to make sure you're getting kind of that your sampling is an accurate view, and there are challenges. But right now, I don't think any of them are insurmountable. To me, the biggest challenge is not, cell phones or respondent refusal. Those are things that are problems. They're very expensive to deal with, but there are ways of dealing with them. The biggest problem is getting the universe of voters right.
Right.
And that's, I talk to smart people about that all of the time, and there's not a magic answer to that.
Right. I mean, Pew did a report a few months ago about this, and they did some September polling, and then they went back and verified people, whether or not they were voters, and then did some follow-up to kind of figure out what would be the best predictors of who was going to vote. And it was a variety of questions. It wasn't just simply how likely you are to vote, but you still can't get it completely exactly right. And we had Scott Keeter on the show, and he said, look, this is an audience, it's a universe that doesn't exist yet when you're polling. It's not like you're getting it wrong because you did something wrong. It's that you're trying to measure something that literally does not exist because you don't know until election day whether or not they're going to, vote. And I think, a lot of folks who watch polling, the polling commentators and handicappers and aggregators and so on, they're kind of looking very closely at how well you're predicting that final number. And that's where a lot of analytics also plays a role. And it's less of a focus on what we know as campaign pollsters and what we do for our clients, that people don't see, that there's much more than just sort of putting a number on it. The number is 42. It's about the writing and the crafting of what you're going to say, testing, making sure everything's included, that your questions are really asking the right questions, that your language really reflects what the candidate's going to say, that you can simulate a campaign environment in some way, or at least best you can. I mean, sometimes we spend so much time focusing on how closely you're going to nail that final electorate that you're not, we're not always paying attention to the rest of what goes on in research.
Yes. And look, I mean, when we work in politics, our clients, care about two things. They do want it to be right. I mean, we are, if the campaign's over, if they won and you told them they were going to lose, they hate you.
Right.
If you lose and they tell them that you're going to win, they hate you even more.
Yeah.
So, getting it right is,
it matters. Yes. I don't want to minimize it.
Reputationally pretty important. And it's what, frankly, it's what we're paid to do. I mean, but obviously, helping with the strategic insight.
Right, but the polls this far out
insights that will shape.
Yeah.
Well, and the truth is, you don't get held accountable for polls this far out. But but I worry now. I worry every day about knowing whether we've got the right people in the sample. I mean, we had 2012. The total number of people who voted was actually lower than 2008. And that's happened a couple of other times, but I don't think we've had 2 elections where the gross turnout has dropped 2 cycles in a row presidentially. But I could see that happening now. I mean, given that only 6% of voters like both candidates, 25% of them don't like either one of the candidates. Under those scenarios, you could see turnout, dropping further from 2012, and so, being able to get the electorate right in the sample is the hardest and the most important thing to do in terms of the accuracy of the polling.
Right. So tell folks how they can find you on Twitter, find the firm, learn about what you're doing.
Well, our website is www.hartresearch, HART research.com. And we try to post news about our current projects on there. On Twitter, I am at Geoff Garin, GeoffGarin. And my email, if you ever want to
careful what you wish for,
get a hold of me, is ggarin@hartresearch. It's on the website, and if you've got questions, I'll try to be responsive.
Well, thanks so much, Geoff. I'm so glad. What a treat for you to come in, and so we could do this in person.
It was great.
Have fun.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
No problem. Take care.
Okay.